And welcome to the American Revolution. This is episode 6. Um, okay, now it's said live. There was a little delay. I'll start over. Welcome to the American Revolution. This is episode 6. We're going to be talking about the evacuation from Boston, the Olive Branch petition, and the battles for New York, which there were multiple battles around New York before it was taken and held for the entirety of the war by the British. I'm joined as usual by MC. How are you doing today, sir?
Doing well, doing well.
And yeah, you can go ahead and get us started on the timeline here. And
Well, let's reiterate and go back and talk about the Olive Branch petitions. So, Congress met, and according to the adjournment, the petition of the king being engrossed was compared and signed by several members to the king's most excellent majesty, most gracious sovereign. Okay, now you'll notice that Congress here is doing something that is quite unique, right? And that's one of the reasons why I want to talk about it a little bit more, is they are placing the Continental Congress, all right, at the exact same level as Parliament, all right? They are saying for the colonies, we are Parliament. For the colonies, we represent the colonists, not Parliament. Right.
so are they? Well, one, that's a direct challenge to the Parliament in London, but two, are they trying to harken back to the Magna Carta and say, look, we want representation on par with that seated in London?
I think it's kind of a combination of a lot of different things, but the fact that they're saying that Parliament does it by this, it's a challenge directly to Parliament, and you're right. This is saying that Parliament doesn't have authority over the colonies, and this is a direct challenge. Now you got to understand the colonies or Parliament can't if you do something like this, right? Well, then how do you manage India? How do you manage the other colonies around the globe? Right, you end up with a problem. All right, this is a big challenge. Okay, this is a gauntlet that's being thrown right in their face. So let's go on. We, your Majesty's faithful subjects of the colonies of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, the counties of Newcastle, Kent, and Sussex, on Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, on behalf of ourselves and the inhabitants of these colonies, we have who have deputed us right, to represent them in Congress, entreat your Majesty's gracious attention to our humble petition. The union between our mother country and these colonies and the energy of mild, just government produced benefits so remarkably important and afforded such an assurance of their permanency and increase that the wonder and envy of other nations were excited while they beheld Great Britain rising to a power the most extraordinary the world has ever known. Her rivals, observing that there was no probability of this happy connection being broken by civil dissension and apprehending its future effects, if left any longer undisturbed, resolved to prevent her from receiving such continual and formidable accessions of wealth and strength by checking the growth of these settlements from which they were to be derived. Now, what is interesting about this whole section here is they're basically trying to reiterate that they're faithful subjects to the crown, not to Parliament, but to the crown, to the majesty. All right, but they're also saying that they didn't want the war. They don't want a battle, and they're trying to basically blame other nations for the rift that they're having with the mother country. Now, this is a bit of subterfuge, to be honest, because the rift that they're having with this mother country is not while France and several of the other powers are more than happy to, see what's happening in Great Britain. All right, they're not they're not the cause of it. Let's be perfectly frank. All right, the French and Indian Wars is not causing the rift between the colonies and Great Britain, regardless of what people say. Regardless of people trying to say, okay, well, yeah, but look at the costs and everything that this is incurring and so forth. Well, you can make that kind of a comment, but you could also look at it and say, well, the colonies could do it themselves. But the colonies are also making another assessment here, and they're saying their worth. You got to remember what the colonists are doing here. The colonists are saying our worth is so great to your majesty. The 13 colonies are such a significant part of your empire, right? We're giving you money, whole large sections of cash. It looks like I've lost Mad Dodge.
No, I'm still here, and that reminds me, actually, of the conversation we had on a previous episode, because the colonists are trying to kind of leverage themselves in between His Majesty and the Parliament, which they're pretty much saying is, look, we'll take your side over issues with Parliament. You can count on us. That would have been a very, I don't know, a very big shift in the political tug of war in Great Britain, right?
Well, all right. The thing is even though the colonists are doing this, right, the reality is that when the colonies were established, there has already been a major shift, all right, in the power dynamics of the crown. You got to remember, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded, it was in 1620, right?
Well, is it correct to say that the king had the power to declare war on any nation he felt fit, but he did not have the power of the purse?
Well, at this point, not really. At this point, Parliament has full power. At this point, the reality is there all the attention, all the power, right, has been replaced, okay, by Parliament. Parliament is now the ruling authority, right? As far as making war, not making war, you could say that technically, all right. The reality is, you can say technically that yes, they were, but the reality is that that's not the case.
Well, and the thing is, if you look at it, and this goes on into the entirety of the war, really, all the way up till the end, because the only reason it ends is Lord North is thrown out as prime minister. So the fact is, maybe the king didn't read the olive branch petition, because word is, at least the last one they sent, he just threw away. But I bet you Lord North read it, and Lord North knew what the colonists were saying, and that would really go to show why he has such venom for the colonies. I've always kind of wondered that.
Well, the colonies are basically saying, you guys have no authority over us.
Yeah, because
that is what this petition is saying. That is exactly what this petition is saying.
Well, yeah, and Lord North didn't want the war to end at all. He was like, let's send more troops. We can take these fuckers.
Right. I mean, in a prosecution of this attempt, events so unfavorable to design took place that every friend of the interests of Great Britain and the colonies entertained pleasing and reasonable expectations of seeing additional force and extenuation immediately given to the operation of the hitherto experienced by an enlargement of the dominion of the crown and removal of ancient and warlike enemies, to a greater distance. At this conclusion, therefore, of the late war, the most glorious and advantageous that ever had been carried out by British arms, your loyal colonists, having contributed to its success, right, by such repeated and strenuous exertions as frequently procured them to the distinguished appropriation of your majesty, of the late king, and of parliament, doubted not but they should be permitted with the rest of the empire to share in the blessings of peace and the emoluments of victory and conquest. While these recent and honorable acknowledgments of their merit remain on the record in the journals and acts of the august legislature, the parliament, undefaced by imputation or even the suspicion of any offense, they were alarmed by a new system of statutes and regulations adopted for the administration of the colonies that filled their minds with the most painful fears and jealousies. And to their inexpressible astonishment, perceived the danger of foreign quarrel quickly succeeded by domestic dangers in their judgment of a more dreadful kind. Okay, they basically are saying that Parliament has created a situation where they're fearing for the power of the colonies. The Parliament is fearing us. They're fearing us for being members of the British Empire, and therefore they have sought to, limit us and hinder us. Okay, we've won this battle. The continent is now ours. We are going to expand and take this continent and fill it full of happy British subjects. All right, as we expand ever westward. Okay, now the reality is that's an accurate assessment. Okay, as much as the British want to complain about things, they were trying to limit the colonies. They were trying to prevent an expansion of the colonies. All right, they had set out as part of the policy to do that. They did fear, many of these people were very jealous that certain colonists were extraordinarily wealthy. All right, extraordinarily well off. All right, now some of that is, just due to the just personal animosity, but there's more to it than that. Okay, because you got to remember, this is something that's hard to get people to understand. When they look at the other colonies, the main colonies of Britain, right? Only the American colonies were really British colonies. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is it's populated by Britons. It's populated by the British people.
Yeah, and they were not. I know we had that argument with Farty, and I hope he's doing okay. If you're out there and you watch this later, Farty, drop a line in the comment section at least to let us know you're all right. But there was some indentured servitude, but by and large, a majority of these people came of their own will and funded their own journey.
One way or another. And the colonists themselves are not made, while there are Native Americans that are part of the colonists, admittedly, while there are slaves and other nationalities that are part of it, the vast majority of the populations in these colonies are British subjects. They are from Britain. Now, you can't say that about India. You can't say that about Africa, the African colonies. You can't even say that about the South American colonies that they have, right?
Or even the Irish Isles. I mean, look at later and past history of Ireland and England going back and forth.
Right. Well, the Irish are not considered British subjects. That's very true.
Or the Scottish or the Welsh. I mean, they can't even control the whole of their entire island.
The British and the Scots, the Scots and the Welsh are part of Britain at this point. Right? I mean, they can say what they want, all right, but they are part of the British. They are part of the British Empire. They are fully British, They're not part of the English. They're not English, but they are British.
That is fair, but me being a prick, I would have wrote that in the petition. To be like, look, Your Highness, your parliament can't control the whole of its own island. How do you foresee controlling our continent without our help? You know what I mean?
I'm going to go down to I think we've basically beaten this enough, all right, as far as the reading of this petition, because I wanted to point out to people so that they understand several major points, right? It wasn't just. Let me give an example of something, right? This is the cusp and the turning point of when this happens, of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution is beginning, right? Everyone is aware that this is beginning. They don't know what it is. They know they're at the beginning of something great, and they're starting to see industrialization take place, all right, and mechanization taking place on the British Isles on a scale that the world had never seen before. And the results of that scale are the fact that you have a massive British Navy that's coming from the islands, that's going around the planet, that is beating some of the more powerful nations on the earth, if not being able to hold, definitely hold their own on the most powerful nations currently at that time. So everyone can see this mechanization taking place. Everyone can see the giant looms that are being built, all right, and the fact that they're starting to mass produce cloth. Everyone is witnessing this, right? As the Industrial Revolution is getting ready to really kick into high gear, and it's almost all of it at this point is centered, okay, on the British Isles. At the same time this is happening, the British are forbidding the export of any of that technology to the United States. They are forbidding the export of looms. They are forbidding the export of the technological advances that are happening on the island to the British colonies in the United States.
Well, that Parliament's fault, or
yes,
is that
those are the laws that they passed.
Yeah, but those laws are written to placate the trade companies. We both know this.
No, they're not. They're not just written to placate the trade companies. They are also written to prevent the indigenous populations from becoming power bases. Tell me, what advantage,
okay,
do you have from a trading perspective? You could look at it saying, well, the trade, the British traders, they want to sell the trade goods to the United States. They don't want competition. That's all well and good, but at the same time, why are they favoring them over the colonists in the United States?
Because
the reason that they're doing it is because they don't look at the colonies the same way that the colonists look at themselves.
Yeah,
they look at the colonies as no different than India, right? Where the Indians are there. All right, they're not British. They're not British, subjects like the people on Great Britain. They're a subjected population rather than British citizens. They think of them as subjects.
Yeah, we covered this with Jensen a little bit. We're only kind of British, is how they saw it. But also, they don't want a power base to congeal in the American continent because of what I said. How can you control an entire continent from an island? Yeah, you have the powerful Navy. You sooner or later have to go inwards into the continental United States or the colonies at that point, and you wouldn't have been able to.
But
Obviously.
that's 50 years down the road, though. That's 2 generations
You're
away. They're
telling
not
me
even
they
looking
don't
at
think
that.
that far ahead? I
No,
think they did.
I don't think that they thought that far ahead. No, they're more. I will admit that they were more far thinking than what we do on average today. All right, but they were not thinking that far ahead. They really weren't. All right, because if you were thinking that far ahead, then the king would have been, hey, how about I just go ahead and step in here and say, yeah, they need to have some representation. Yeah, let's put this in here. Okay.
Well, it could have been as simple as one rep from each colony. And, Benjamin Franklin's already there. Bam, you're Pennsylvania's rep, right? I mean, it would not have been hard. And they still would have had a minority vote in the parliament.
Right. But it would have been a block. But it would have been a block. All right, let's be honest. It would have been a block. Okay, it would have been a block of a number of ministers. All right, that they could have served, and there would be discussions as to, well, how many people do you allow? How many representatives do you allow from Virginia or New York versus Massachusetts or Rhode Island? Right. So it would have, and they would have formed. It would have been a colonial bloc. Now the question is okay, how do you handle the colonial bloc? It would have been interesting to see the different machinations if such a thing ever happened. All right, but it never happened.
Yeah. One last note on that, and then you can continue on. I will have to step away for a sec. Just a couple minutes. But no, it would have been interesting because what do you do with the colonial bloc? The same thing they do in DC. You shun the new people coming in for like 6 months, and then you start inviting them to the parties and you turn them over to your side. That's how it works. That's why you can't blame the swamp.
Well, but at the same time, the colonists would have still been their own voting bloc with their own interests. All right, that would have been different than the voting blocs of Parliament, and they would have been saying things like, "Why can't we have our tools? Why can't we have lathes? Why are you preventing gun manufacturing in the United States where we're actually using the friggin' guns? This way, we don't even have to transport the dang things down there." All right. All of this would have come to the fore at some point.
Sooner rather than later, I think, with Indian insurrections and France. Well, France would have never been in upheaval. Anyway, we're going down alternate history now. So go ahead and continue, and I'll be back 5 minutes tops. I just have to run inside real quick.
Okay. So after that, what you have, the Olive Branch petitions, they of course are exactly what Mandoc said. They're not well received. The king never even, I don't think, even reads them. I don't think it ever gets to him. The people in Parliament obviously have no intention of moving forward because it's a direct threat to their power. It's a direct threat to the Parliament's power and the Parliament's control of the British Empire. All right. It would have created a dynamic that the British Empire would have then been forced to deal with other elements, and which one becomes a power block in and of itself over time will shift. Now, the natural resources of the entire continent of the United States is obviously far superior to the natural resources available on an island. Granted, it's a large island, all right, but anybody with any kind of common sense can look at this and say, okay, they're going to have all the natural resources of our island, plus, because they already have. How are we going to compete with them? Okay, we don't want to become the basket case. This is where it all began from. We don't want to become the basket case. So this is why they're trying to prevent the industrialization from taking place at some point in the United States. And of course, they're Americans are chafing at this, and it's not. Additionally, it's not really working. Okay, why isn't it working? Now, Mad Dog said something that was very accurate, right? And that is the politicians in Parliament were very much creatures, I guess is the best way to put it, of the different trading unions, the different trade groups. Okay. So if you have a manufacturer of textiles, right, they don't want extra competition. Now, there was not going to be the hindsight is 2020, right? For the United States to produce cloth, all right, of the same quality and the same standards that were happening with the British Isles, the United States would have to have really changed and really grown up and been able to focus on doing that. And even then, even if it could produce the same amount of cloth, you still got the additional cost of shipping. So the sale of that cloth, the sale of that material overall would remain under the normal situations, okay, strictly localized, meaning the cloth that was being produced in Great Britain would remain the cloth that was being produced in Great Britain. The cloth that was being produced in the Americas would be the cloth that was being produced in the Americas. You wouldn't have much of a trade opportunity to trade that cloth. But then again, how much wealth are you really getting from the colonies in that regard? It's not a tremendous amount. From an agricultural standpoint, you got some issues, right? Because the raw materials and everything, to ship the raw materials is a bit more difficult, all right? But at the same time, shipping cotton, the vast amounts of cotton, yeah, that's fairly easy to do. The cost of that would still be cheaper in Britain than to try and produce the material, because it's still got to be shipped to various different colonies within the United States, where looms would then create it and turn it into textile products. So the cost and so forth would be astronomical from that standpoint. So it wouldn't happen. What I'm trying to point out is the trading companies were the ones that were looking at saying, okay, we're going to lose a market here. But in reality, losing that market wasn't going to be a big issue to them from a percentage-wise. All right?
I don't know about that. I don't know about that because
the East
Southern
India Company,
plantation owners, almost every founding father from the South that owned a plantation died in debt to those trade companies.
Okay, but
like, look at Jefferson. Jefferson was massively leveraged.
When the United States was formed, right? Did those trade companies collapse?
No, they then shifted over to the Asian markets. You're right.
Okay, the idea that they were going to somehow majorly suffer, okay, was way overestimated, because the amount of material being purchased wasn't as significant as where other opportunities existed to begin with for them. All right, and it was never going to be a big thing for them to begin with. All right, it was less. This is why I say now. This is all hindsight. Hindsight's 2020. All right, but at the same time, this mindset, okay, that had brought and equivocated, because I guarantee you that in the United States, a U.S. colony, right, or a British colony in the 1760s. Did not see themselves as the same type of colony as India.
Well, no, but when it comes to the trade companies, they could stop in North America at port. They could sell merchandise there. They could resupply and move American merchandise through the Caribbean and then back to the British Isles. You know.
Sure, but that was going to happen anyway. That wasn't going to stop. Right? Even as America began to production began in the United States. Yeah, production would begin in the United States, but it was never going to be a very quick affair. the colonies weren't that big yet. They would get there. Don't get me wrong, they'll get there, right? But the colonies don't even really, the colonies, the American colonies, America doesn't really become close to a power until the Civil War. And look how big America had to be to compete with an island.
That's a good point. Yeah, go ahead and let's get to, since we have about a half an hour, give or take, depending on if we go over or not. Let's go to the British evacuation from Boston.
Okay, so now the British have their mainstays. They wanted to punish the Northeast, the ones that they said were the ones started the Revolution. All right, so they have invaded Boston. They are holding Boston with a small number of troops, not a whole lot. Right, they fought the Battle of Bunker Hill. They beat the Americans back from Bunker Hill, but they don't have the forces to actually continue the battle. So they're still more or less surrounded. All right, at which point, all right, cannons begin to appear. All right, heavy cannons begin to appear. All right, in the American lines. And these are cannons that were brought over, all right, from Fort Ticonderoga, and they have the reach to reach at least into the harbor. Okay, so the harbors are no longer completely safe. Now, what's interesting about this is General Knox is the one who basically brings these cannons in. And he does this across a winter, through ice, through snow, and he doesn't lose the number of cannons he starts off with is the number of cannons he ends with. Now, at one point, between 2 and 6, I'm not really sure. The stories are a little vague. Between 2 and 6 of the cannons, as he was trying to take them across frozen rivers, break through and go right to the bottom. He actually drags them out. He has an operation and actually brings them out. I mean, this guy, you gotta give him kudos for creativeness and stubbornness to go, no, I'm not losing these cannons to the bottom of the river.
I know.
I mean, Knox may have been a fat boy, and he was a bit chubby, by the way. All right, for those who don't know who General Knox is, you can look him up. He did like to eat. There's no doubt about that. All right, but he is able to bring these up, and the British are forced to say, "Okay, we're going to leave," and they load up in their ships and they leave. Now, where did they go? They just went a little ways north. All right, over to the Canadian part that was not rebelling against them. Right, in Halifax, and they waited because they knew that the Crown was sending reinforcements. And when the Crown sends reinforcements, it sends them to New York.
Yeah, and before you go into New York, because George Washington does build some forts, he does prepare defenses, so I'm sure you want to touch on that. But as far as the Americans are concerned, at least on what I read, that fleet that left Boston, they didn't know where it went. Or have you read something different? Was there?
They didn't. They weren't sure. They weren't sure where it went, but they weren't really worried about it because they were still more worried about what was coming. And what happens is the British send the fleet. They send a massive war fleet. All right, to Halifax, pick up the remnants of the people that were evacuated, and then descend on Boston. And they descend on Boston with over 100 warships.
New York. Sorry to
New York.
correct you.
I'm sorry. Yes, correct. They go back. They don't go back to Boston. They go to New York. They descend on New York. All right, with over 100 ships at one time. 100 ships. This is in the 1770s, folks. The British are able to float just to the United States. regardless of where the rest of their shipping is around the world, they're able to send 100 warships to New York.
Yeah, and the Culper spy ring was in the very beginning process of being set up around this time. But I can just imagine some of the Patriots looking out and seeing this just mass of ships and being like, yeah, I think we done messed up, Bob.
you now are seeing the full force of the British Empire. And even then, it isn't the full force. This is the sad part. You are seeing that the Empire is now serious about trying to put this down. Okay. They come in and settle in New York immediately. They have several thousand Hessians with them. All right.
Well, and what's weird too is they don't just immediately go in New York. I think that's what you said. So I'm agreeing with you there. They actually sit there and kind of drive General Washington insane.
Well,
Right?
he lands, and Washington now has to try and figure out, okay, what can I do? And the reality is that he's outmanned, he's outgeneraled, all right, and he's limited in what his capabilities are, right? But this, of course, leads to the Declaration of Independence, right? And this is the unanimous declaration of the United 13 Colonies of the United States. When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth and separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. This, just that first paragraph, is saying much more than people realize. First of all, it's placing an onus, saying we recognize our responsibilities to tell you, okay, what our grievances are, to tell you why we will no longer listen to you. We will no longer accept it. And that's something that had never been done before. Okay? No one had ever said, oh, well, we're declaring independence and here's the reasons why. People said, we're not listening to you before we declare ourselves independent from you. But they never had given a list. Here's the reasons why you will no longer, all right, we are dissolving these bonds. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah. Thomas Jefferson wrote property there. I just want that mentioned.
Well, but it's not what was approved. While Thomas Jefferson did write the draft for this, there were edits, and these are the edits.
Yeah, and since you brought that up, yeah, everybody that watches this later and is watching it, just imagine Jefferson sitting there as they rip apart his document line by line. He was fuming.
Well, yes and no, but then again, Franklin forces him to edit part of it himself.
Yeah, Benny Boy did do that. That is true.
All right, so because it still comes down to the fact that sometimes people even have to be forced to understand. Okay, you're going to have to compromise.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, where he had to compromise was on something he never should have compromised. But,
yeah, no, and that was Benjamin Franklin's idea, if I remember it correctly. He's like, okay, you lay the sin of slavery at the feet of the king, but you say nothing about us continuing it. We should just take this out.
Yeah, the thing is Jefferson was going to, if the American colonies had declared. Now you got to remember this: in the American colonies, there were obviously there's same slave states. There were slave states and so forth, but slavery was legal throughout the colonies. You had slaves in Boston, right? Now you didn't have a lot, but you still had slaves in Boston. You had the majority of slaves down south. Why? Because they had the larger working plantations. Okay, so you have massive numbers of people. So therefore, that's why you had more slaves.
Yeah, but Delaware was heavily slave all the way through the end of the Civil War.
Well, it wasn't heavily. I think at the time the Civil War began, they had less than 1,000 slaves. All right,
that's fair. I meant heavily now, and then it did wane. I should have specified a little bit better. I stand corrected there.
But not all the colonies, even when they were slave colonies, were really that focused on slavery. For example, Thomas Jefferson being a Virginian, Virginia was going to vote for secession, even if it ended slavery within Virginia. At this point, okay,
yeah.
So there were a couple of the southern colonies, Georgia being one of them,
South Carolina,
South Carolina, maybe North Carolina. It's hard. North Carolina is kind of an odd thing because North Carolina there was a serious bifurcation within the people of North Carolina because they truly didn't like the South Carolinians. This is one of the strangest things. There could have easily been a civil war between North Carolina and South Carolina, all right, if they had remained separate colonies. There was going to be a battle between them because they for whatever reason, they had an entire different philosophical outlook on life between North Carolina and South Carolina.
Don't they still kind of hate each other?
Yeah, they do. they still have a little bit of this. Anyway, we hold these truths to be self-evident. I already read that. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That wherever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and institute a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such forms as to them shall most likely to affect their safety, happiness, prudence. Indeed, will dictate that the government long established should not be changed for light and transient causes, and according to all experience have shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than the right themselves to abolish the forms to which they are accustomed. All right. He's saying that people will get used to tyranny. And they'll get used to it to the point where it becomes so onerous that they have no other choice. Right?
Yeah, and he has a point.
But when a long train of abuses and usurpations pursuing invariable the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of the colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their forms of systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is the history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having the direct object of establishing an absolute tyranny over the states. To provide this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. Now, this is a bit of hyperbole, in my opinion, because look, the reality is they're ignoring Parliament completely again. They're saying, well, we're not at war with Parliament now. We're at war with the king. They're not even acknowledging that what in their minds, Parliament is nothing more than a tool of the king, and they know better. All right, they know that Parliament has the authority in the British government. Right. The idea that they would say this without reference to Parliament is quite frankly wrong. Okay?
I don't know. I would defend it, and this is how. I would defend it on the basis that their charters were signed by the crown, not the parliament. They owe their allegiance to the crown, not parliament. Therefore, parliament is insignificant. And the crown has repeatedly ignored their petitions for peace and thumbed his nose at them.
That's true. But it's also, once again, sticking it in the eye of Parliament. You can't ignore the fact that this is a slap right at Parliament to not even say that they exist.
You know what's really interesting is my aunt did my mom's side of the family tree, and I'm actually related to Lord North. I didn't know it was the Lord North from Parliament, but I think he's the only Lord North. So, yeah, I must be the black sheep in that family.
Well, when you think about it, you were a traitor once, a traitor twice, going for 3.
Hey, I'm not joining Antifa.
I'm sorry. That was awful rude of me.
No, it's all right. Third time's a charm. We might win this time.
All right. He has refused his assent to laws, the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws that immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend them. He has refused to pass, notice this, he has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people would relinquish the right of representation in legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. So they're basically saying that all of this is part of the king's responsibility. That the king, now remember this, initially they had gone to Parliament saying we seek representation, but now what they're saying is that the reason we don't have representation in Parliament is because you, the king, are keeping us from being represented in Parliament. Now,
when really it's Lord North's government that is refusing them representation and issuing the taxes.
Well, they're also the ones raising the funds for the for the weapons and the men to put down the rebellion.
Okay, I want you to continue, but why is it in times like this where it comes between the Doves and the Hawks, right? And the Hawks usually win, and they'll continue to win as long as the war goes well. Once it starts to falter, though, the public sentiment sways towards the Doves. You saw this in Vietnam in our own history, and you see this in British history with the American Revolution, among other wars. Why do you think that is? Is that just humanity? Is that a fault of us?
Well, it's an aspect of humanity. Let's be honest. We are violent creatures. We live in a violent world. Anybody, we live in a technological world that has shielded many people from seeing that we live in a violent world. We don't control nature. We don't control each other, really. All right? Which is the natural state, trying to control. One of mankind's, I think, natural aspects of itself is that it wants control. It wants to establish control over what they have, and then once that part's secured, keep expanding. It is part of human nature to do that.
Absolutely, but if you look back, once again, hindsight 2020 and all, but if you look back, the Dubs were arguing, look, give them representation. As I said earlier, they're not going to be able to sway the entire vote. And what?
Well,
For what? Sit some stupid Indian guy in here too, and an Aussie. I don't give a shit. Like, shove them all in here.
well, but
There's
as soon
still
as you
going to
start
be
going down,
minorities.
as soon as you go down that road, though, all right. Oh, that sounds well and good when you're talking about the British colonies in America. What happens when you start adding the Chinese colonies? What happens when you start adding the Indian colonies?
Yeah, because once you get the representation in, then there's going to be a push for proportional representation,
Right. Now
and that's where you get messed up.
And we talk about the American colonies, but you forget you had the British colonies up north too. You had the Canadian colonies, all right. You had the Caribbean colonies, right?
Yeah, and you can go ahead and continue. I just if the Dubs would have got their way, at least for the American colonies, it would have avoided the French Revolution, Napoleon. It could be argued World War I and II could have been avoided with no Napoleon dividing up and restructuring the European continent. I mean, a lot would have changed.
I don't see that happening. Right? I really don't. All right. I seriously don't. You're making a number of assumptions there, but
Yes. That's why I love alternate history. I get to make those assumptions and then be like,
I don't. First of all, the French Revolution was going to happen one way or another.
I beg to differ, sir, but that might be a upcoming.
We can talk about that in a different manner. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on their rights of the people. He has refused for a long time after such dissolutions to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers incapable of annihilation have returned to the people at large for their exercise, the state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states for that purpose of obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. In other words, they're doing what they can to prevent the westward expansion and new settlements, all right, from ever expanding into the continent. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. In other words, he is telling the colonists that they can't govern themselves from a judicial standpoint, that it still has to come from the crown. But what's worse is they're picking people from the British Isles to serve as judges. He has made judges dependent upon his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers, this is the tax collectors, right, to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. Okay, this is something that I touched on, but I don't think people really understand what's happening with this. There are a number of standing armies that are in the colonies, but they have orders to prevent westward expansion. They have orders to try and keep the peace with the Native Americans, to try to do whatever they can to keep the colonists where they're at, all right, so that the natives don't get restless and attack them, forcing them to act. The colonists, on the other hand.
Well, yeah, I mean, I kind of understand the king's perspective on this. That would be a giant bleeding wound in the belly of the British Empire to constantly have to send troops indefinitely to quell Indian
They would they wouldn't have to.
insurrection.
The thing is that they wouldn't have to. Right. If only they had opened up manufacturing of weapon systems, all right, within the colonies, as the colonies were starting to do it on their own anyway, all right, you wouldn't have had that as an issue.
Yeah, but then you get the issue Mexico found with Texas. Yeah, come on in and follow our rules. Everything's fine. And then the Americans come in under the guise of relocating to to be Mexicans, and then they cause an insurrection and take over fucking Texas.
Well, yeah, they caused an insurrection for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is over slavery, which several people have gotten arguments with. It is one of the things. It isn't the only thing, and I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most important thing, but it was one of the driving forces. All right, that separated them from the rest of Mexico with Santa Anna.
Yeah.
But I don't want to go into that because Santa Anna was a dictator. All right, a la like a king. All right, he wasn't as capricious as many people think of him as. Although when you have that amount of personal authority, some capriciousness is going to be seen. It's going to be perceived.
Yeah, and go ahead and I think the Declaration. You're almost through the whole thing, so go ahead.
He is affected to render the military independent of and superior to civilian power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction of foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving assent to the acts of pretended legislation for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states. Now, what he's basically saying there, or what this is saying here, basically is you're allowing other people to try these people. You're saying that the trial for these people are not happening by the inhabitants of the states, which is that's somewhat inaccurate. Okay.
Wait. How? Because I'm going to bring up a specific point. The trial of the soldiers of the Boston Massacre that John Adams defended were found innocent, but yet they were still sent to England and put on trial there.
Okay, well, so what you're saying is that the trial here in the United States is immaterial.
The king voided it, which is what they're complaining about.
In that specific case, to a point, but even when they went back to Great Britain, they were found innocent, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, but the problem is, what the king is saying at that point is you are too young and too immature to govern yourself. Obviously, you need me to do it.
Well, that's true. For cutting off our trade to all parts of the world. For imposing taxes on us without our consent. For depriving us, in many cases, of the benefits of trial by jury. For transporting us beyond the seas to be tried for pretended offenses. For abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once as an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule in these colonies. Basically saying you're ignoring the charters, which is once again the same statement in the next one, for taking away our charters and abolishing our most valuable laws and altering it fundamentally the forms of our governments. This is very true, to be honest, of Pennsylvania, because there was a major redress of going back to the charters that the colonists attempted just the Pennsylvania colonists, all right, that the king ignored. for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with powers to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. All right. And in a sense, yeah, that's what's happened. That is true. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, destroyed our lives and our people. This is a bit of a overstatement of things here. All right. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death and desolation and tyranny already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely unparalleled in the most barbarous of ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. Don't bring
and he is doing that. He's sending the Hessians, and the Americans, frankly, are terrified of these German mercenaries.
Well, because the German mercenaries are quite frankly harsh. And they are. They're okay. Let's talk about this for just a minute, because the mercenaries are mercenaries. People forget this. How will it go, man? They are being paid, and one of the things that they were being told was it's okay to plunder. Okay.
Yeah, didn't they have a little song? You know, we're going to go to America. Riches will be ours. Everything you ever wanted is in America. They're like, no, go home, you fucker.
I mean, and that is a problem, right? Being able to seize when somebody says you're a rebel and then taking all of it. Saying, okay, you're a rebel. We're going to seize all of your territory. We're going to seize your farm. We're going to seize all the farm goods. We're going to seize your merchandise. We're going to seize your pigs, your house, your coats. All right, your silverware. All right, all of that.
Well, and there was reports, whether they were exaggerated or not, of the mercenaries committing acts of rape. The usual rules that get broken in war. You know.
Yeah, but I do think that they were extraordinarily overblown. Let's be perfectly honest. They were overblown. Did the mercenaries, for the most part, the Hessians, comported themselves actually fairly, mildly overall. Right? There were incidents, okay, where people were basically rounded up and shot and so forth. All right, as examples and so forth, that did happen. All right, but overall, from the way these campaigns normally go, it wasn't always that. It wasn't all that bad. It really wasn't.
Yeah, especially, I mean, if they were out raping and pillaging, do you think Trenton would have been so easy? We'll go back to that when it's time, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, we'll talk about all this. All right. Let's skip down there. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in Congress, thus in General Congress assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly, there it is, solemnly, publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that of all political connection to them, and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as a free and independent states, they have full powers to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may by right do. And for the support of this declaration, with the firm reliance on the protection of his divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Now,
Yeah, and I think that's actually the perfect spot to end it because we're at the hour mark, and then we
well,
can go right into New York.
I want to talk about this a little bit more, though.
Okay, go ahead.
As soon as this was read in Congress, everyone stopped. The votes were taken, and when their votes were read out, everyone stopped. Because they knew what they had done.
Yeah, it's called treason. You might have heard of it.
And so everyone was looking at one another. And everybody knew that they were going to have to sign. But they also knew the first person who signed, the first group of people who signed, they were the ones that were going to be hunted. That's when you got John Hancock step up and go, give it to me, I'll do it. And he put his name big and bold, okay, onto the Declaration of Independence, which is why his name is really known in American history. All right. More than any other thing is the fact that he stepped up and said, I'm going to put my name to this. All right. Boldly and proudly in front of everyone. All right. And he became, and he was a 100 man. Oh, they did. The British were waiting to get a hold of him because they would have hung him right then and there. He'd have gotten a sham trial. All right. And they would have hung him. They would have hung him. I do not believe they would have transported him to Britain to hang him. I think they would have hung him in the colonies if they caught him.
You don't think they would have did the whole drawn and quartering thing? I mean, the Brits love that shit.
Well, by that time, that had been toned down, dude. They weren't drawing and quartering people by that time.
Oh, come on. They love that shit. Ask Jensen. He wants to bring it back.
But Jensen wants to bring back a lot of things, some of which makes sense and some of which is a bit much when you really think about it.
Could you imagine John Hancock's head hanging from London Bridge like William Wallace?
Well, I mean, the thing about doing something like that, right, is you want to do that for the population to see. Well, what's the population going to see in Great Britain? We wouldn't have the same effect, right?
Yeah, true. Is it just dramatization in the HBO miniseries John Adams, or did Benjamin Franklin actually say it? Because I always get confused with the quotes because the great quotes are sometimes overly dramatized.
Which quote?
Right after they signed it, it said that he proclaimed, "Well, we either hang together or we hang separately."
Yeah, I think he said that. He said now's the time, but I don't think he said it when they signed it. I think it was before they signed it. I think it was before they actually voted on it, finished the vote, right? Because the vote took place kind of in an odd. It didn't take place in a single moment, right? It was taking place through several days.
Well,
and so.
Yeah, because the representative from Delaware actually showed up late, right?
Well, they basically brought one of the guys in. I think it was it Reed or McClellan? I'm not sure which one of the ones they brought in to help seal the deal. All right, because the way the states did the voting was they were voting not by person. All right, they were voting by state. All right. And so you had people that were voting for this, all right, and actually had voted against it. Okay. But signed it. Because their state, they were outvoted in their state.
Well, yeah, and I believe the representative from Pennsylvania he refused to sign it. He thought it was the colony's death warrant, and he humbly was busy that day.
So there's several of these things that went down that way, but yeah. So what was interesting is he had, for example, Pennsylvania had 8 or 9 representatives, right? Rhode Island had 2. New Hampshire had 3. Okay, I mean it's just Georgia had 3. Okay, Virginia had 7. Okay, New York only had 4. All right, New Jersey had more. They actually had 5. All right, so the numbers within the groups, all right, within the states themselves, varied dramatically. Delaware had 3, for example. All right, so like I said, the numbers for that were in Congress, but their vote was by state. They would have their own little caucus together, and then it would vote by state. Now, there is I don't want to call it a myth, a tale, I guess is the best way to call it, from Pennsylvania, where the vote for Pennsylvania was actually very close when Benjamin Franklin said, okay, we demand each representative declare their vote out loud and do it by name. And James Wilson was the final representative from Pennsylvania. And the story goes that he couldn't bring himself. He himself didn't want to vote for the Declaration. He would have voted against it. If Pennsylvania had caucused internally without anybody knowing. But as he was the one, it would have been his name. He was the one who stopped it. He was the one who stood in the way in history. And he didn't want his name known in history. He was not somebody who wanted to be out front and people to know. And so he sided with the Patriot cause or the independence cause.
Yeah, and it had to be in the back of Benjamin Franklin's mind as they signed that his own son is a loyalist and will never speak to him again.
He does speak to him, but he does not ever. There is no reproachment.
Oh, did he speak to him? Okay, because I always heard Benjamin went to see him. They got into a fight, and then they went their separate ways for the rest of history. His son actually ended up in Britain, right?
Yeah, I think in Britain there's a point in Britain where they meet, but there is no reproachment. There is no bygones, let bygones be bygones moment.
Which is really odd. There's a documentary. It's the Revolution, actually, from the History Channel, though, and they bring up the fact that it really is an interesting point. The old man is the rebel, and the son is the conservative. It is odd, isn't it?
Well, is it? All right, his son is not the one who was dressed down by Parliament. Remember, Benjamin Franklin is not a patriot. All right, he is a hardcore loyalist till he got dressed down in Parliament. He is not. I mean, he's a colonist, and he's for the colonist cause in that they have their own issues. Okay, but he is not a rebel by any stretch of the imagination until he gets dressed down in Parliament. Well, his son didn't get dressed down, right? And so he's, his son doesn't doesn't have that same personal animus. And the son also knows that his father, is reacting emotionally to that. All right. He knows that. In his mind, and it's understandable in his mind, that his father is acting emotionally. But you can imagine how that goes, especially when you're talking, what do you owe your loyalty to more, the king or to your father? And when Robert chooses chooses the king over his father, all right, that's it. You're out of the will. You're dead to me. You're dead to me. Don't speak his name. So.
But yeah, the Battle of New York is hopefully next week if everything lines up correctly. I don't believe we're gonna need to talk about the hospital ships until later, but the POWs that's a story we're gonna have to cover. The American POWs.
We're going to have to talk about them to a large extent because so much of our history is more involved in that than people realize.
Yeah, absolutely. And George Washington makes some questionable decisions. He needs to make them because he can't trade the infantry for the naval assets that were captured.
Logistically, he doesn't have the capability, right? For a variety of reasons. We need to discuss Washington's limitations, all right, but we also need to talk about Washington's view of things, okay? Because part of this is also his mentality, right? And it does play a role into this, okay? There's a reason, all right? There's a reason that his staff never abandons him, okay? And it has to do with him and his personality, but as a result of his personality and so forth, it does leave him with certain blind spots, all right, and certain foibles, all right, that negatively impact some things, right?
Yeah, and I kind of want to get your thoughts, pick your brain a little bit about his strategy, because Washington is very much of the mind to go musket to musket with the British regulars, and I don't think that was the way it should have gone. I think the battle in the South proves that, and I would like to kind of pick your brain about that a little bit next week too, at least with Washington's defeats in New York. We'll have to wait for the Southern campaign because that's a ways off.
Well, the Southern campaign's a ways off, but you're still going to go. Maybe next week. It depends on how fast we talk and how much we talk about New York. But I do think we need to go into Washington. We need to discuss a number of different things, a number of possibilities. All right. And the other thing to remember is we see New York today as a city. Right. That's not the way it was. Okay. It was a series of villages. Right? So, I mean, today is not how the situation was back in the 1770s, and we need to acknowledge that as well. We need to cover some of that. And do like a map of New York and say, look, here's what you are looking at.
Yeah, I'll try and find this week a map of New York, the harbor area at least. That way we can have that on the screen for everybody. And I will be doing a red eye this week. We're still continuing with the GoFundMe, but I didn't want to throw the link in this video because, well, this is a long running series. And yeah, I don't want to throw the GoFundMe in there. But I have been collecting stories for a red eye this week. And wow, some people are just really crappy parents. I think that'll be the theme of the next red eye.
Some people are crappy parents. Is that what you're going to do?
Oh, I found some stories. I'll tell you what, man. Wow. 11-year-olds with cocaine in their system and babies ODing. Pennsylvania, I'm looking at you. What happened? All right. MC, you're not doing a morning show tomorrow. You're gonna try and do it in the afternoon?
No, I'll do an afternoon one tomorrow. Tomorrow will be afternoon. So.
All right, awesome. Thank you everybody for watching this live, and you good folks that watch it later. Please hit like, subscribe, and come join us on the Red Eye. Hopefully, we'll be talking about the confirmation of a Supreme Court justice sometime in the next week or two. I hope. We'll have to see. We're out of here.